Welcome to the first lecture in this series on net zero. The starting point of any discussion about how exactly net zero is going to be achieved is to be ruthlessly and brutally realistic about not only what the baseline now is, but what's happened in the last 30 years of trying to do something about climate change. It's back in the end of the 1980s when Mrs. Thatcher made her famous speech about climate change, and early 90s when the Framework Convention on climate change was put into place. And we've had basically 30 years since then. And I'm afraid that, and there's no other way of putting this, we have achieved pretty much nothing in those 30 years. And by achieving nothing, we've allowed emissions to continue and the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere to go way past 400 parts per million. It is an unremitting, from a climate change point of view, disastrous period. So, most people in the climate change world are familiar with the fact that the carbon concentration's gone up, and it's gone up a lot in the last 100 years. But I think it's less appreciated that not only is this a spectacular increase in carbon concentration in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, but that there's nothing since 1990 in terms of any blip in that upward path of roughly adding about 2 parts per million per annum. And indeed, the last couple of years have been amongst the worst that we've experienced in terms of extra carbon emissions. And of course, it's not just carbon. I'm using carbon for a shortcut for all the other greenhouse gases, but it's not a pretty picture. So the long run curve shows this is entirely unprecedented in the last 10, 20,000 years. And on top of that, it shows in the short run it's at best a linear path of increasing concentration of carbon, but actually it's probably tilted up a bit towards the end. And remember, these measures are estimates. Our ability to precisely measure this stuff is being refined all the time. But we're pretty confident in knowing what the global emissions pattern looks like. So you might ask yourself, how could it be that after all this effort, all the speeches, all the money spent on mitigation measures, that we're in this sorry state we find ourselves? Well, the corollary of the growth of emissions is that the last 30 years have been the great golden age of fossil fuels. Imagine standing in 1990 and proclaiming all the great things that were going to be done to tackle climate change, and in fact putting in place the foundation for the great global expansion of the fossil fuel industries on a scale, given they're already pretty large, that's unprecedented. And if you look at the three fossil fuels, the really disastrous pattern since 1990 has been the really big growth in coal. Coal remains about 40% of the world's primary energy sources. And behind that great growth in coal since 1990 and all the emissions that have gone with it lies China. The economic transformation of China, doubling in size in less than every 10 years, has been overwhelmingly coal-fired and in energy-intensive industries. And the scale of this is just unprecedented globally. So China was a net exporter of coal at the end of the 1990s. It's now half the world's coal trade. And so whatever the benefits to the population of China of the economic transformation has been, from a climate change perspective, and indeed for a wider environmental perspective, it's been a pretty unmitigated environmental disaster. So coal's gone up and up and up. True, it's levelled off a bit towards the end of the period, but all those coal stations that have been built and are currently being built, particularly in China and in the One Belt, One Road China areas, pushing out its new trade routes, its new Silk Road, its new maritime routes. All of that lot added together is put in place a juggernaut of continuing coal burn. And we cannot afford that and have any serious attempt to limit global warming to 2 degrees. So coal's pretty awful. The story on oil, well, oil's carried on growing in share. Oil goes to petrochemicals and particularly transport, and the march of the fossil fuel driven engines, diesel and petrol, etc., goes on relentlessly. The big new player on the block is natural gas. Back in 1990, it was illegal to burn natural gas in power stations in the United States and in Europe, so in much more than half the world's economy at that stage, because gas was supposed to be a premium fuel which ought to be reserved for the fossil fuel industries. Now it's the fuel of choice for power generation. It's had a very big expansion and it has rosy prospects going forward. So gas is gaining, oil's holding its own, and coal powers on. The great golden age of fossil fuels is the last 30 years wasted in addressing climate change. And if we look forward, the projections on coal, oil and gas out to 2040 should not give anyone investing in the idea that net zero is going to work much confidence that current framework and current policy is going to deliver the right answers. Why? Well, even in the IEA's projections, if you look at something like coal, you'll see that they claim that it'll only be 25% of world energy requirements rather than 40% now. You might think good news, and you might think some easing back on, but there's not much of it, on on oil and gas might help that. But what you have to bear in mind is that if the world's economy is growing at 3 to 4% per annum in GDP terms, then it's doubling every 20 years. Indeed, it's more than doubling. And if China, India and Africa grow at between 6 and 8% per annum, they're doubling every 10 years. So the scale of the world economy and the wall of consumption that goes with it in 2040 is so large that even a smaller percentage like 25% for coal is still a bigger absolute number. And of course, for net zero globally, you can't have a world of pumping out more coal, burning more coal than we're burning today, and achieve the objectives of mitigating climate change and trying to hold the line at net zero in, say, 2050. And, we've got population to go with that too. So, we're adding another 3 billion people by the end of the century, more than likely. That's nearly more extra people by the end of the century than the total world population in around 1950. So we've got many more people, much more economic growth, much more consumption, lots more oil, gas and coal. And that's the reality. So what you have to ask yourself is, how did we get to this? How was it possible to have this huge global initiative? The UN Framework Convention, the IPCC doing the climate assessments, politicians all around the world proclaiming how important climate change was, and actually nothing result. And the answer to that goes to the heart of the problems in the Kyoto framework and then subsequently what we have now, Paris. Neither of these frameworks are going to crack this problem. We need something more, and in much of the rest of this lecture series I'll be dealing with what more we need. But let's just be clear on Kyoto and then Paris. Kyoto ended up being effectively an European framework. The Japanese dropped out, so did the Canadians. The US, who promoted Kyoto in the first place, dropped out. This was not a world of American commitment. Clinton, Bush, Obama, and now Trump have all been distant from the framework. And of course, Russia was bribed to join the framework so that the numbers added up to the crucial 50% in exchange for being encouraged by the Europeans to get into the WTO framework. So if you look at the Kyoto framework, it's really, in the end, a European frame. Remember, developing countries didn't have to have targets. They were going to try and take measures, but not have binding caps. And, you know, the Europeans will tell you, oh, well, we did a good job. Look what we did in controlling our emissions. Look at the 2020, 2020 targets, and so on and so forth. Well, you can look at them, and you can look at the costs of choosing some of the most expensive options first to reduce carbon emissions. You can look at the closure of nuclear in Germany. You can look at the expansion of coal in Germany. You look at the failure of the Europeans, notably the Germans, to be out of coal until almost 2040 on their projections. And you can ask, how did this contribute? But it's much worse than that. Because, of course, the reason why the Europeans could reduce carbon emissions was because Europe was deindustrializing. And as we'll come on to see in subsequent lectures, you know, one of the consequences of Kyoto was simply to accelerate that decarbonisation in Europe and that export of carbon-intensive industries elsewhere so that we could import back their carbon-intensive products. So if you look at steel, if you look at fertilizers, if you look at petrochemicals, if you look at aluminium, if you look at even cement, all this stuff that we used to produce in Europe, we now import. It makes us look good, but of course our carbon footprint has not gone down at all. And this is how it can be the case that the apparent success of Kyoto in Europe can actually lead to either no or increased carbon concentration globally. Basically, we in Europe and the United States bought all that carbon-intensive stuff behind that phenomenal economic growth in China. Now, if you listen to the activists and you read what the politicians say and the speeches they make, you'd be led to believe that, never mind, Kyoto may or may not have worked, but don't worry, Paris is going to do the job. Well, really? How exactly is Paris going to achieve this outcome? First of all, it's based on carbon production. Secondly, the targets are inconsistent with 2 degrees. And thirdly, in a world of China first, Russia first, and America first, how exactly are these pledges that people make going to be enforced? The whole idea for Paris, from Copenhagen to Durban, through all the razzmatazz of the conference of the various parties, was these targets would be legally binding. But, you know, it's all very well to call something legally binding, but you have to enforce it. These things won't even be legally binding, let alone enforced. How exactly do you tell the Brazilians that they must stop cutting down the Amazon at 1 hectare a minute? How do you tell the Russians to put out the fires raging across Siberia? How exactly do you make the Middle Eastern oil producers act to decarbonise and act in such a way as to make their key economic assets unviable and therefore worthless in due course? This is never going to work. Of course, Giorgio is a good idea, and there's quite a lot of media coverage. It keeps the UN teams in business, and of course the NGOs have a field day. And they will in 2020 at the next big milestone in the Paris process. But the lesson from the last 30 years is that if you go down this route, you will not stop climate change, and you will not agree the 2 degrees limit, and you will not put grit in the wheels of the great fossil fuel industries. We need something more, we need something much more ambitious, and we need, while of course doing the jaw globally, we need something that's bottom up. And that's where, in principle, net zero comes in, but only the right net zero concept. And that's about carbon consumption, not just carbon production. And that's something I'll be exploring further in the rest of this lecture series. Thank you very much.